Have you ever witnessed a room filled with laughter, only for it to fall silent, hushed by a simple yet undeniable truth? Do you believe that with just one conversation, someone who was once mocked could change an entire crowd's perspective on life? Today, I want to tell you a story. A story about the power of integrity. About a quiet yet persistent perseverance stronger than any noise. And about the miraculous strength of truly listening. On this journey, you will see a confrontation that seemed overwhelmingly one-sided, turned into a stunning reversal. How Edward Grant, the aging man dismissed by many, managed to sway even the youngest, most modern minds. And a lesson not just for the famous, but for all of us, navigating today's noisy world. Before we begin, I want to ask you. In daily life, are you someone who truly listens, or just someone waiting for your turn to speak? If that question made you pause for a moment, stay with me. Because this story may not only change how you view a talk show, but also how you view yourself. Let's return to that evening, where the stage lights blazed, applause echoed, and an encounter veered beautifully off script. Samantha Lewis was a familiar name in the late-night television world. Sharp, quick-witted, and unafraid to challenge the most powerful figures, she had built her empire on biting humor and razor-sharp comebacks, sometimes even ruthless. During a routine production meeting, under the bright glare of fluorescent lights, a bold idea was proposed. Let's invite Edward Grant. Edward Grant, the living symbol of old Hollywood, synonymous with values like honor, integrity, and self-reliance, and a representative of a generation many young people deemed obsolete. The entire room burst into laughter at the suggestion. A conservative legend stepping into Samantha Lewis's progressive, dazzling world? It was like throwing a deer into a den of wolves. Samantha smiled. For her, this wasn't just a chance to boost ratings. It was a chance to catch the trend, to do what her audience, a generation that adored progress and awakening, would cheer for, exposing outdated values live on television. In recent years, American culture had witnessed the explosive rise of cancel culture, where a single misstep could exile a person from public life. In that climate, Samantha's plan to catch Edward off guard live on air was hardly unusual. She was simply doing what many others were doing, forcing others to conform to new standards. Unconsciously, she believed she was standing on the side of what's right. We've seen many monuments fall just because of a speech deemed outdated. Kevin Hart had to give up hosting the Oscars over decade-old tweets. J.K. Rowling faced cancellation over controversial opinions. Samantha, like many in modern media, believed that breaking old values was the path to progress. True progress doesn't always come from destroying the past. Sometimes it comes from listening, understanding deeply, and building upon existing foundations. We may disagree with the previous generation. But if we only mock without understanding why they thought that way, we're merely deepening the chasms that divide us. And so, while Samantha and her team eagerly sharpened their arrows for the fateful evening, somewhere far from the stage lights, Edward Grant, with silver hair and a worn cowboy hat, sat in his small kitchen, sipping black coffee, reading the invitation letter with a faint, knowing smile. He knew what awaited him. But his reaction would surprise everyone. Let's move forward and discover what happened. When the invitation was placed before Edward Grant, he did not frown. He did not scowl. He didn't ask a single question. He simply stayed silent. One hand holding his cup of black coffee, the other lightly tracing the lines of the polite yet challenging letter. Jack, his longtime assistant, couldn't hide his worry and broke the silence. "Are you sure you want to accept?" "Samantha Lewis, it's not friendly territory." Edward simply glanced out the window, where the afternoon sun bathed the vast rolling hills in golden light. And with a faint smile, he replied, "Friendly or not, a conversation is a conversation. People can say what they want. The truth remains the truth. No anger. No complaints. Just absolute calm, a silent strength few possess. In a world where people rush to react and defend, Edward's approach was like a river flowing around rocks. Gentle, but never broken. He didn't need a thick armor for protection. He didn't need rehearsed witty comebacks. Because he knew, personal truth doesn't need to be defended with weapons. It simply needs to be lived. We've seen this in the greatest individuals. When Nelson Mandela walked out of prison after 27 years, he did not speak with bitterness or vengeance. He simply said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." True strength is not loud. It's quiet, and therefore, unshakable. Sometimes, the greatest strength we can display is not in fighting, but in calmly stepping into challenges with honesty and unwavering trust. No need to fight back. No need to brace ourselves. Just to be present, and let integrity speak for itself. Thus, when night fell and the stage lights in that distant city began to shine, Edward Grant, unarmed, undefended, was ready to walk into a conversation everyone thought he would lose. But, as we are about to see, truth carries its own weight that even laughter cannot overthrow. Let's witness the moment when silence began to reign over the room. The stage lights blazed brightly. Waves of laughter rippled through the auditorium like small waves crashing against the shore. Samantha Lewis stepped into the spotlight. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, her hair perfectly styled, her eyes gleaming mischievously. She was ready, like a seasoned performer stepping onto her familiar stage. Starting with a few witty takes on the day's news, she quickly drew the audience to her side, as usual. But everyone knew the most anticipated part hadn't yet begun. Samantha took a deep breath, smiled, half warmly, half mischievously, and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, we have an icon, a living legend. Someone who made us fall in love, and sometimes made us wonder. Is talking to an empty chair really the pinnacle of art?" The audience burst into laughter. Applause and whistles blended into a brief chorus of excitement and anticipation. A little explanation. In American late-night shows, audience laughter isn't just a natural reaction. It's a weapon. The more the host makes the crowd laugh, the more psychological advantage they gain in any upcoming conversation. It's a form of psychological armor, where crowd support becomes an invisible shield for the host. Samantha knew this well. And she skillfully used humor to turn the room into her battlefield. Edward walked onto the stage. Not rushing. Not faltering. He wore a simple jacket, jeans, and worn leather shoes, nothing suggesting he was preparing for a confrontation. He merely approached, gently shook Samantha's hand. Then gave a slight nod to the audience, with a smile, not defensive, not provocative. Just a small moment. But the studio seemed to quiet down slightly. Because, faced with the jests, Edward did not retaliate. He accepted them, like the ocean accepts the winds. It was reminiscent of Fred Rogers, the beloved host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. When mocked for being overly innocent during the 1970s, Fred never responded with anger. He simply smiled and continued his mission of spreading love and kindness. That quiet steadfastness eventually made him a timeless icon. You cannot control how others treat you, but you can always control how you respond. Confidence needs no defense. Integrity needs no armor. It's inner calm that provides the firmest foundation when facing storms. Thus, while Samantha launched sharp, cutting questions, hoping Edward would fumble, lash out, or at least, play defense, he simply sat there, steady as a lighthouse before a storm, ready to respond not with resistance, but with the timeless language of truth. Let's see what happened when words began touching the deepest corners of that room. Samantha Lewis was used to commanding the stage. She threw out sharp questions, witty jabs carefully crafted to make any guest scramble to defend themselves. And that night, she deployed the same tactic on Edward Grant. "You starred in films that today would make many people frown, Edward. Rigid masculinity, outdated values. Have you ever wondered if the new generation still needs those things?" The audience roared with laughter, some even clapped. Samantha leaned forward, like a boxer about to deliver a finishing blow. But Edward did not back down. He did not flinch, nor did he justify himself. He simply smiled softly. And in a voice roughened by time, he replied, "I believe, every movie, every character, is a product of its time. Values may not always be perfect. But they are the first stones laid for future generations to build something better. No resentment. No opposition. Just a simple truth, and the weight of that truth began to settle over the room. In confrontations, people usually expect one of two things, fight or flight. If you do either, you are playing by the conventional rules of engagement. But when you do the third thing, when you stand calmly, face it, and simply speak the truth, you completely disrupt your opponent's rhythm. That's exactly what Edward did. He didn't join the game of who's right, who's wrong. He simply stood firm in his own authenticity. Another image comes from Abraham Lincoln. During the 1860 presidential campaign, Lincoln endured brutal attacks, slander, mockery, and cruel jokes. Yet he rarely retaliated. He chose to respond with calmness and gentle humor, often making both his opponents and the crowd unable to help but listen. And it was that demeanor, not shouting, that carried him to the White House. Sometimes, you don't need to win the debate. You just need not to lose yourself in it. Integrity doesn't need to defeat anyone. It simply needs to exist. And by its mere presence, integrity forces falsehood into silence. And so, with each answer, with each composed glance, Edward was like stones dropped into a restless lake, raising ripples of reflection amidst the initial noise of laughter and applause. Samantha, so used to controlling the stage, began to feel something unfamiliar. She was no longer entirely in command of the room. And then, Edward began to tell his life story. A journey from darkness to light, from failure to success. A story that would bring the entire room to silence. As the atmosphere in the studio softened, Edward Grant, the simple man with silver hair and calm eyes, began to tell his life story. No theatrics. No exaggerations. Just a real story, told in a real voice. "I grew up in a small, poor town. No one in my family ever dreamed of Hollywood. When I first set foot in that city, I was just a skinny young man with a dream and nothing in hand but stubbornness." The entire auditorium fell utterly silent. People were listening, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Edward spoke of his early days. Of background roles no one noticed. Of cold, harsh rejections. Of long nights driving deliveries, setting up chairs for hire, just to make a living. He chuckled softly as he recalled. "There were days I wondered if I was wasting my whole life chasing a foolish dream. But somehow, I kept telling myself, just one more day. One more try. One more chance." We often only see the final glory of a person. But behind every monument are hundreds, thousands of tiny moments when they chose not to give up. Personal stories have a magical power. They remind us that even the greatest were once small, once doubtful, once fallen, just like any of us. Oprah Winfrey was once fired from her first broadcasting job for being unfit for television. Walt Disney was fired for lacking imagination and having no good ideas. But instead of letting failure define them, they used it as a foundation to rise. Just like Edward Grant. Never giving up, even when no one believed he would succeed. Success isn't a tale of giant leaps, but a tale of countless small steps. Persistent and unseen. You don't have to win every day. You just have to not give up. And then, after years of perseverance, a small role in a cowboy movie came to Edward. No one placed high hopes on that film. But with everything he had accumulated, from failures, from days of waiting, Edward breathed an extraordinary authenticity into the character. The movie became a breakthrough. And the rest is history. But success didn't change Edward's view on strength. Instead, he deeply realized one thing. True strength doesn't lie in shouting louder, but in enduring, standing firm through every storm. As Edward's story neared its end, an unusual silence blanketed the studio. No more raucous laughter. No more easy applause. Only stillness, and contemplation. Edward leaned back in his chair, fingers intertwined. His eyes slowly sweeping across the room. He spoke, slow but steady. People often mistake strength for shouting, for fighting, for proving they're right. But I have learned. True strength is not about fighting against the world, but about continuing to walk forward even when the world isn't on your side. In a world increasingly polarized today, we are easily swept into thinking we must shout to be heard, must fiercely fight to prove we're right. But resilience, true resilience, comes from another source. Persistence, patience, and the trust that your value does not require noisy validation. Resilience is continuing to move forward, even when every step meets headwinds. Think about Rosa Parks, the small black woman who refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus in Montgomery in 1955. She didn't shout slogans. She didn't scream. She simply sat, calm and steadfast. And with that act, shook an entire nation. It wasn't shouting, but quiet determination that ignited the civil rights movement. Sometimes, the most powerful way to change the world is to refuse to let the world change you. You don't have to scream to prove your existence. You just have to stand firm, day after day. And that night, as Edward sat there, amid blinding lights and hundreds of watching eyes, he showed everyone. Persistence doesn't need to be flashy. Steadfastness doesn't need to shout. And true strength always comes from within. But there was another thing that made Edward a symbol. The courage to remain true to himself, even when it wasn't popular. Samantha Lewis, by then, had ceased her sarcasm. She no longer fired sharp questions. She simply sat there, listening, for the first time in a long while. Edward Grant, the man predicted to fail that night, was now capturing the hearts of the room. With nothing but one simple thing. Authenticity. He spoke slowly, yet firmly. I know that what I believe may be out of fashion. I also know I can't please everyone. But I have always believed. Speaking your truth, with respect, is far more important than trying to be liked. In a world obsessed with likes, shares, and public approval, it's easy for us to think our value comes from the crowd's applause. But the truth is, real value comes from having the courage to stand firm in what you believe, even if you stand alone. Dave Chappelle, the legendary comedian, once walked away from a $50 million contract when he felt his show was straying from his core values. He chose truth, self-respect, over easy fame. And although he was misunderstood and criticized, Dave Chappelle is now remembered as a symbol of artistic integrity. Sustainable success doesn't come from pleasing the crowd. It comes from living true to yourself. Fame can come and go. But self-respect, once lost, is incredibly hard to reclaim. And that evening, under the blazing stage lights, Edward Grant didn't just remind everyone of the value of authenticity. he made Samantha, and millions watching from home, begin to ask themselves, am I living true to what I believe? Or am I merely living for the applause? And from that moment, change began. Not just for Samantha, but for anyone brave enough to listen. Samantha Lewis, who had once stepped onto the stage full of vigor, now sat, silent, hands loosely clasped on the table. Her gaze, once sharp as steel, had softened, with a touch of wonder, and perhaps, honesty. She didn't interrupt. She didn't cut in. She simply listened. For the first time in a long while, Samantha Lewis, the woman famous for controlling every conversation, allowed a real story to unfold, uninterrupted. Listening, truly listening, is a rare act in today's world. We often listen to reply, to argue, to prepare our own response. But to listen as Samantha did that night, to listen to understand, to allow someone else to exist fully within their story, that is truly a form of love and courage. Many studies show that the greatest leaders, like Barack Obama, aren't the ones who always have the fastest answers, but the ones who listen most deeply. They create spaces for stories to be heard. And it's through that listening that change is born. When you truly listen, it's not only others who are healed, but you yourself are healed too. Because sincere listening is how we see the world. Not just through our own eyes, but through the hearts of others. And that night, in the warm stage lights, Samantha Lewis changed. Not through a grand declaration, not through winning a debate, but simply by allowing herself to listen. Yet the power of that moment didn't stop within the studio walls. It rippled out, beyond the screens, touching millions of hearts, and sparked a new conversation across America. As the stage lights dimmed, and the audience quietly left their seats, none of them could have predicted that conversation would not end on stage. It had started a wave of change. Just a few hours after the broadcast, social media exploded. But not with backlash. Not with the usual arguments. Instead, it was filled with thoughtful reflections. For the first time in years, I truly sat down and listened. Thank you, Edward Grant. Thank you for reminding us that integrity still matters. There are small moments, seemingly just exchanges between two people, that have the power to spark deep reflection in millions of hearts. This is the ripple effect, the gentle spreading waves. A small pebble tossed into a still lake. But the ripples travel endlessly, reaching distant shores beyond our imagination. Within just a week after the interview, major newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Time magazine simultaneously published articles. The quiet power of integrity, what Edward Grant taught us all. Why America needs more conversations like this. In schools, sociology and public speaking classes used the interview as a discussion topic. The power of sincerity in a noisy era. Even leaders, CEOs, and influencers began quoting Edward Grant's simple yet profound words. Never underestimate the power of an honest conversation. Because sometimes, just one conversation is enough to change a generation. You don't have to be a politician, a speaker, or a celebrity. You just need the courage to listen. The courage to share your truth. And you have already begun creating the first ripples. And that night, in a room filled with light and silence, Edward Grant didn't try to stir up a storm. He simply planted a small seed, a seed of integrity and perseverance. And the miracle was, America, and all those weary hearts out there, were ready for it to grow. But to truly understand that profound power, we need to pause, to reflect. Why are integrity, resilience, and listening timeless values? When that interview ended, and the stage lights gradually dimmed, what lingered wasn't the sharp questions, nor the raucous laughter. What remained were three enduring lights. Like small lanterns glowing amid the stormy world. Integrity, resilience, and listening. In a society that changes at a dizzying pace. Where fame can come and go overnight. Where noise easily drowns out authentic voices. We might forget. The most enduring values are never outdated. Integrity, living true to your values, whether anyone is watching or not. Resilience, continuing to move forward, even when every door seems closed. Listening, opening your heart to embrace things you've never understood before. Nelson Mandela endured 27 years in prison and still walked out with forgiveness. Malala Yousafzai stood up for girls' right to education even after nearly losing her life. Fred Rogers spent a lifetime quietly sowing seeds of love through children's television. None of them became great because they shouted louder. They became great because they lived more truthfully. If you ever feel lost in this noisy world, remember. Hold fast to your integrity. Keep walking with perseverance. And truly listen. That is always the right path. Even if it seems slower. Even if it seems quieter. And just like ripples on a lake. Those values will spread farther than you can imagine. When we look back at that evening. When an aging man. A sharp, confident woman. And a room full of hearts searching for something real. Touched upon a simple truth. We realize. The world doesn't need louder voices. The world needs more genuine hearts. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Perhaps, after today's story, we will each step out. A little more sincere. A little more patient. And a little more willing to listen than yesterday. And if so, then that evening. And stories like this one will never become outdated.